first time I saw the body bag, I knew I should have trusted my instincts about the new neighbors. It was just past 3 a.m. when the scraping sound jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was part of my dream, a remnant of the anxiety that had been building since the Harises moved in next door 3 months ago. But as I lay there in the dark, ears straining, I heard it again, a heavy, dragging noise, followed by a thud. My wife, Sarah, stirred beside me. "What's wrong?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Nothing," I whispered, already slipping out of bed. "Go back to sleep. I'm just going to check on something." I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. Our bedroom overlooked the Harises' driveway, giving me a clear view of their detached garage and the back of their SUV. In the pale moonlight, I could make out a figure struggling with something large and awkward. My heart raced as I squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. That's when I saw it, a long, dark shape being shoved into the back of the vehicle. It was unmistakably the size and shape of a human body. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not in our quiet suburban neighborhood, where the biggest excitement was usually a lost dog or a disputed property line. But deep down, I knew this moment had been building since the day the Harises arrived. It had started innocently enough. Sarah and I had been excited about new neighbors. Our street was mostly retirees, so the prospect of a family closer to our age moving in was refreshing. We'd even baked cookies to welcome them. Mark and Julie Harris seemed nice enough at first. They were in their mid-30s, like us, with 2 kids around the same age as ours. Mark worked in logistics, while Julie was a stay-at-home mom. They smiled and chatted, accepted our cookies graciously, and promised to have us over once they were settled. But something felt off from the beginning. Maybe it was the way their smiles never quite reached their eyes, or how they deflected personal questions with vague answers. I brushed it off as moving stress, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Weeks passed, and the promised invitation never came. The Harises kept to themselves, rarely venturing out except to shuttle their kids to and from school. Their curtain stayed drawn, and any attempts at neighborly small talk were met with polite but firm rebuffs. Then the packages started arriving. At first, it was just 1 or 2 a day, nothing too unusual for a family settling into a new home. But soon it became a steady stream, sometimes 10 or more deliveries daily. The odd part was the names on the packages. They were never addressed to Harris. Instead, a parade of different names appeared on the labels. Johnson, Smith, Garcia, Patel, and dozens more I didn't recognize. When I casually mentioned it to Mark one day, while retrieving our mail, his face tightened. "Oh, those," he said with a forced laugh. "Julie's into online reselling. You know, buy low, sell high. It's her little side business." I nodded, pretending that explained everything, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about his tone, the way his eyes darted around, it all screamed that he was lying. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. I noticed Mark's irregular hours, coming and going at all times of the day and night. I heard muffled arguments through the walls, snippets of heated conversations about shipments and timetables. Sarah told me I was being paranoid, that I should give them space to settle in. "Not everyone wants to be best friends with their neighbors," she'd say with a shrug. But she hadn't seen what I'd seen, hadn't felt the growing dread in the pit of her stomach every time she looked at that house. I started losing sleep, lying awake at night, listening for any unusual sounds. More than once, I could have sworn I heard crying coming from their basement, but it was always too faint to be sure. The night everything changed, I'd finally managed to drift off when that scraping sound yanked me back to consciousness. Now, as I stood frozen by the window, watching Mark Harris struggle with what could only be a body bag, every fear and suspicion I'd came crashing down on me. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. Who do you call when you think you've just witnessed your neighbor disposing of a body? 911 seemed both obvious and somehow inadequate. As I stared at the keypad, paralyzed by indecision, A sharp knock at the front door made me jump. My phone clattered to the floor. "Tom!" Sarah's voice drifted up from downstairs. "There's someone at the door." Panic gripped me. Had Mark seen me watching? Was he here to silence us? I rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. Sarah stood by the front door, her hand on the knob, ready to open it. "Wait!" I hissed, grabbing her arm. "Don't open it." She looked at me, confusion and concern etched on her face. "What's going on? You're scaring me." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mr. Johnson? Mrs. Johnson? It's Mark Harris. I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Sarah's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to respond, but I clamped my hand over it, shaking my head frantically. I pointed upstairs, mouthing, "Call 911" as clearly as I could. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but something in my expression must have convinced her. She nodded and crept back upstairs while I stood rooted to the spot, staring at the door. "Please." Mark's voice came again, a note of desperation creeping in. "I know you're awake. I saw the light in your window. This is important." My mind raced. What should I do? Confront him? Pretend we weren't home? I glanced at the kitchen, wondering if I could reach a knife without making noise. Before I could decide, I heard a key turning in the lock. My blood ran cold as I remembered. We'd given the Harises a spare key for emergencies when they first moved in. It had seemed like the neighborly thing to do at the time. The door swung open, and there stood Mark Harris, his face pale and drawn in the dim light of our entryway. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his clothes were rumpled and dirty, as if he'd been digging in the garden or burying a body. "Tom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need your help." I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Stay back," I warned, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw what you were doing. I'm calling the police." Mark's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face before it was replaced by something else. Desperation? "It's not what you think," he pleaded, taking a step forward. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, anger suddenly overriding my fear. "The body you were stuffing into your car? The weird deliveries? The lies?" He flinched at each accusation, but didn't deny them. Instead, he sagged against the doorframe, looking utterly defeated. "You're right," he said softly. "I've been lying. We all have. But it's not what you think. We're not killers, Tom. We're running from them." The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but the raw fear in his eyes stopped me. "What are you talking about?" I finally managed to ask. Mark glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be lurking in the shadows. "We're in witness protection," he said, his voice barely audible. "Or we were. They found us. Again, we have to leave tonight, but we need your help." My mind reeled. Witness protection? It sounded like something out of a movie, not something that happened in real life, certainly not in our quiet neighborhood. But it would explain so much. The secrecy, the strange deliveries, the constant vigilance. "The body?" I asked, still not fully convinced. Mark shook his head. "Not a body. Our belongings. We have to make it look like we vanished into thin air. No traces left behind." As if on cue, Julie appeared behind him, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she begged. "We don't have much time. They could be here any minute." I hesitated, years of suspicion warring with the desperate plea in their eyes. Could I trust them? Or was this just another lie? A ploy to lower my guard? The sound of sirens in the distance made the decision for me. Sarah must have called 911 after all. Mark's face drained of what little color it had left. "Oh, God," he whispered. "They're here. We're too late." In that moment, looking at the sheer terror on their faces, I knew they were telling the truth. Whatever they were running from, it was real, and it was deadly. "Quick," I said, making a split-second decision I hoped I wouldn't regret. Out the back. Take our car. The keys are by the door. They stared at me in disbelief for a moment before Julie burst into tears. Thank you, she sobbed as Mark practically dragged her toward our back door. As the sirens grew louder, I watched them disappear into the night, two shadows melting into the darkness. I had no idea if I just helped save a family or aided criminals in escaping justice. All I knew was that nothing in our quiet suburban life would ever be the same again. The police arrived minutes later, full of questions I couldn't or wouldn't answer. As the night stretched into dawn, with investigators combing through the abandoned house next door, I sat on my front porch, nursing a cold cup of coffee. Sarah joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "Do you think we'll ever know the truth?" she asked softly. I squeezed her hand, my eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hints of sunrise were beginning to appear. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I have a feeling this is just the beginning." As if to underscore my words, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up across the street. Two men in suits stepped out, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the early hour. They surveyed the scene with grim expressions before approaching our house. I stood up, bracing myself for whatever came next. One thing was certain. Our quiet suburban life was over. The real mystery was just beginning. I never thought I'd fear the sight of my own neighbor, but there he was again, a statue in the darkness, eyes fixed on my bedroom window. This was the 14th night in a row, and with each passing evening, the distance between us shrank. It started innocently enough. I'd recently moved into a quaint suburban neighborhood, eager for a fresh start after my divorce. The house was perfect. 2 stories, a sprawling backyard, and neighbors that seemed friendly enough during my first week. But as I soon learned, appearances can be deceiving. My bedroom window faced the side of my neighbor's house, offering a clear view of their yard. I hadn't paid much attention to it at first, too busy unpacking and settling into my new life. It wasn't until that first night, about a month after I'd moved in, that I noticed something odd. I'd gotten up for a glass of water around 2 a.m., bleary-eyed and half asleep. As I passed by my bedroom window, a movement caught my eye. There, in the dim glow of the streetlight, stood my neighbor. He was perfectly still, facing my house, his gaze seemingly fixed on my window. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Surely, I was seeing things. Who stands in their yard in the middle of the night? But when I looked again, he was still there, unmoving. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly stepped away from the window, my heart racing. For a moment, I debated whether to call the police. But what would I say? My neighbor is standing in his own yard. I decided it must be a bizarre coincidence and tried to go back to sleep. The next night, curiosity got the better of me. I found myself peeking out the window around the same time. To my shock and growing unease, there he was again. Same position, same unnerving stillness. This continued night after night. I began to dread the sun setting, knowing that in the early hours of the morning, he'd be there, a silent sentinel in the darkness. I considered confronting him during the day, but every time I saw him outside, he acted perfectly normal. Mowing his lawn, checking his mail, waving hello as if nothing was amiss. I started losing sleep, my nerves frayed from the constant state of alert. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and my co-workers began to ask if everything was all right. How could I explain that my neighbor's nightly vigil was slowly driving me to the brink of paranoia? By the 10th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to document what was happening. I set up my phone to record the window, hoping to capture evidence of this bizarre behavior. When I checked the footage in the morning, my blood ran cold. There he was, standing motionless for hours, only leaving just before dawn. Armed with this evidence, I finally worked up the courage to talk to him. One Saturday afternoon, I saw him working in his garden and walked over, my heart pounding. "Hey there, neighbor," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up, smiling warmly. Well, hello? Beautiful day, isn't it? I nodded, thrown off by his friendly demeanor. Yeah, it is. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Of course, he replied, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. What's on your mind? I took a deep breath. I've noticed you standing in your yard at night, like every night, for hours, facing my house. His smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. I'm not sure what you mean. I sleep pretty soundly through the night. I have video, I blurted out, immediately regretting my words as his expression darkened. For a moment, tension crackled in the air between us. Then he laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Video? Of me sleeping? That's a bit creepy, don't you think? I think you must be mistaken. Maybe you're seeing shadows or something. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me cold. There was a warning there, a threat lurking just beneath the surface of his affable exterior. You know, he continued, his tone light but his words pointed, it's not nice to spy on your neighbors. People might get the wrong idea, might think you're the one who needs watching. With that, he turned back to his gardening, effectively dismissing me. I stood there for a moment, stunned, before retreating to my house, my mind reeling. That night, I didn't dare look out the window. I lay in bed, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. I told myself he wouldn't be out there, that I'd imagine the whole thing. But curiosity and fear are a potent combination. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't resist any longer. I crept to the window, heart in my throat, and peered out. He was there, and he was closer, much closer, where before he'd always stood near his house. Now he was halfway across his yard, still facing my window with that same unnerving stillness. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. The next day, I called the police. I showed them the videos, explained the situation. They listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They promised to talk to him, but warned me that standing in one's own yard, regardless of the hour, wasn't a crime. I saw the police car pull up to his house later that day. From behind my curtains, I watched as they spoke to him on his porch. He was all smiles and friendly gestures. After a few minutes, the officers left, and I saw him look directly at my window, that same cold smile on his face. That night, he was even closer. This pattern continued, night after night. With each passing evening, he moved closer to the property line between our yards. I became a wreck, jumping at every sound, constantly checking and rechecking my locks. I called the police again, but they seemed annoyed now, warning me about false reports. I considered moving, but the thought of leaving felt like letting him win. Plus, who would buy a house with a neighbor like that? I was trapped. On the 14th night, I couldn't sleep at all. I paced my room, alternating between peeking out the window and hiding from it. Around 2:30 a.m., I steeled myself for another look. My heart nearly stopped. He was at the property line, closer than he'd ever been. But this time, something was different. He was looking up directly at my window, and he was smiling. I scrambled away from the window, my back hitting the opposite wall. This was it. He knew I was watching. Whatever game this was, it was escalating. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone to call 911, but as I dialed, the screen went black. I frantically tried to turn it back on, but it was dead. Impossible. I just charged it. A loud thud from downstairs made me freeze. It sounded like the back door. No. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't be in the house. I had to be imagining things. Another thud. Closer this time. Footsteps on the stairs. In a panic, I lunged for my bedroom door, my trembling hands struggling with the lock. Just as I heard it click, something heavy slammed against the other side. "Neighbor," came his voice, sickly sweet and terrifyingly calm. "We need to talk about all this spying you've been doing. It's not polite, you know. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room for a weapon, an escape route, anything. The window. It was my only chance. As I ran towards it, the bedroom door splintered open. I didn't look back, didn't hesitate. I threw open the window and climbed out onto the roof, the cool night air hitting my face. Behind me, I heard him enter the room. Now, he called out, his voice eerily casual. There's no need for all this drama. I just want to make sure you understand the rules of our little neighborhood. I scrambled across the roof, my bare feet slipping on the shingles. I could see my car in the driveway. If I could just make it there. A hand grabbed my ankle, yanking me back. I screamed, kicking wildly, my nails scraping against the roof as I was pulled towards the window. You should have minded your own business, he hissed, his friendly facade finally dropping. Some things aren't meant to be seen. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted around and kicked him square in the face. He let go, stumbling back with a howl of pain. I didn't waste a second. I half ran, half slid down the roof, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I ignored it, forcing myself to my feet. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, acutely aware of the open window above me. As I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, I saw him climbing out onto the roof. Our eyes met for a moment, and the hatred I saw that would haunt me for years to come. I peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I drove aimlessly, putting as much distance between us as possible, my mind reeling from what had just happened. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I found myself in a gas station parking lot, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I knew I could never go back to that house. Whatever sick game my neighbor was playing, I wanted no part of it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I was safe now. I'd find a hotel, call the police again, figure out my next move. But as I reached for my phone to search for nearby hotels, my blood ran cold. There on my screen was a text from an unknown number. You can run, neighbor, but remember, I'll always be watching. I looked up, scanning the empty parking lot, suddenly feeling exposed. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the asphalt, I realized that the nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. The moment I saw my wrench caked in dry blood, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake in trusting my neighbor. But by then, it was already too late. It all started on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing sinister seems possible. I was in my garage, tinkering with my old Chevy, when I heard a knock at the side door. It was Dave, my next-door neighbor of 3 years. "Hey, John," he said, flashing that easy smile of his. "Sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if I could borrow your pipe wrench. Mine's busted, and I've got a leaky sink that's driving me crazy." I'd always liked Dave. He was friendly without being overbearing, the kind of neighbor who'd wave hello but respect your privacy. We'd shared a few beers over the years, swapped stories about our jobs, me at the local hardware store, him in some vague consulting role he never quite explained. "Sure thing," I replied, wiping my greasy hands on a rag. "Let me grab it for you." I rummaged through my toolbox, found the wrench, and handed it over. Dave's eyes lit up like I'd just given him a winning lottery ticket. "You're a lifesaver, John," he said, testing the weight of the tool in his hand. "I'll bring it back in a day or two tops." I thought nothing of it at the time. Neighbors borrow tools all the time, right? It's part of that unwritten suburban code. But as the days stretched into weeks and then months, with no sign of my wrench, a nagging feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. At first, I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Dave was a busy guy, always coming and going at odd hours. Maybe he'd just forgotten. But every time I saw him outside, he'd quickly duck into his house or car, avoiding eye contact. After about 6 weeks, I decided to bite the bullet and ask for it back. I caught him one morning as he was getting his mail. "Hey, Dave," I called out, trying to keep my tone casual. "Any chance you're done with that pipe wrench? Got a project I could use it for." Dave froze for a split second, then turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh man, John, I'm so sorry. Completely slipped my mind. I've got a big job I'm in the middle of. Can I get it back to you next week?" I nodded, trying to ignore the way his eyes darted around, never quite meeting mine. "Sure, no rush. Just whenever you're done." But next week came and went, and still no wrench. I started paying more attention to Dave's comings and goings. His consulting job seemed to involve a lot of late-night activity. Cars I didn't recognize would pull up at odd hours, stay for a short while, then leave. One night, unable to sleep, I glanced out my bedroom window and saw Dave in his backyard. He was digging what looked like a small hole, constantly looking over his shoulder. When he finished, he rushed back inside, leaving me with a cold feeling of dread. The next morning, I decided enough was enough. I marched over to Dave's house, determined to get my wrench back and put an end to this weirdness. But as I raised my hand to knock, the door swung open. Dave stood there, looking haggard and surprised. "John, what are you doing here?" "I came for my wrench," I said firmly. "It's been months, Dave. I need it back." His face went through a series of emotions, surprise, fear, then a forced calm. "Right, of course. Come on in. I'll grab it for you." Stepping into Dave's house felt like entering another world. The blinds were all drawn, casting the interior in a perpetual twilight. Boxes were stacked everywhere, some labeled with what looked like code names. A acrid smell hung in the air, like chemicals and something metallic. Dave led me to his garage, flicking on a dim light. "It's in here somewhere," he muttered, rummaging through a cluttered workbench. That's when I saw it. My wrench, partially hidden under a tarp. But it wasn't the same shiny tool I'd lent out. This wrench was caked in a dark, rusty substance that looked horribly like dried blood. My heart began to race. I looked at Dave, who was still pretending to search, then back at the wrench. In that moment, every odd thing I'd noticed over the past months came crashing together in a terrifying picture. "Dave," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "What's going on here?" He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. The friendly neighbor facade dropped away, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You shouldn't have come here, John," he said quietly. I backed away, my hand fumbling for the door handle. "I'm just here for my wrench. That's all. I don't want any trouble." Dave took a step towards me, his hand reaching behind his back. "I'm afraid it's too late for that. You've seen too much." In a panic, I yanked the door open and bolted. I could hear Dave's footsteps behind me as I raced across his lawn and into my own house, slamming and locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But before I could dial, a text message popped up on the screen. It was from Dave. "Think carefully about what you do next, John. You don't know what you're getting into. For your own safety, forget what you saw." I stared at the message, my mind reeling. What had I gotten myself into? What was Dave involved in? And most pressingly, what was I going to do now? The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I'd jump at every sound, constantly peeking out my windows to see if Dave was watching. He seemed to have vanished. His car hadn't moved, and I hadn't seen any sign of him. I debated going to the police, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor borrowed my wrench and returned it covered in what might be blood? That he was acting suspiciously? It all sounded so flimsy when I tried to put it into words. On the fourth day after the incident, I was startled awake by a loud knocking at my front door. Hesitantly, I made my way downstairs, my heart pounding. Through the peephole, I saw two men in suits, looking stern and official. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" They flashed badges at me. "FBI, we need to ask you a few questions about your neighbor, David Reston." My stomach dropped. What about him? The agents exchanged glances. When was the last time you saw Mr. Reston? I swallowed hard. A few days ago. He borrowed a tool from me. Is he in some kind of trouble? The taller agent's expression darkened. Mr. Reston is a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. We have reason to believe he may have been involved in some unsavory activities. My mind flashed to the bloody wrench, the late-night visitors, the hole in the backyard. What kind of activities? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. I'm afraid we can't disclose that information at this time, the other agent said. But it's imperative that you tell us everything you know about Mr. Reston, any unusual behavior, strange visitors, anything at all. I hesitated. This was my chance to come clean, to tell them everything I'd seen and suspected. But Dave's warning text flashed in my mind. What if he wasn't working alone? What if telling the truth put me in even more danger? I don't know much. I heard myself saying, he keeps to himself mostly. I haven't seen anything unusual. The agents looked skeptical but didn't push. They handed me a card with a number to call if I remembered anything, then left. As I closed the door, I caught a glimpse of movement from Dave's house. A curtain falling back into place, as if someone had been watching. My blood ran cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, second-guessing my decision to lie to the FBI. Around 3 a.m., I heard a car pull up outside. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Dave hurriedly loading boxes into his trunk. He was running. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and the FBI agent's card. But as I began to dial, my phone buzzed with a new text message. I know you lied for me, John. Smart move. Remember, we're in this together now. Don't do anything stupid. I stared at the message, then at Dave's house, where his car was now pulling out of the driveway. In that moment, I realized that by trying to stay out of trouble, I'd entangled myself even deeper in whatever dark web Dave had woven. As the sound of his car faded into the distance, I was left with a chilling certainty. This was far from over. Whatever Dave was involved in, whatever he'd done with my wrench, I was now an unwilling accomplice. And somewhere out there, my neighbor, a man I now realized I never really knew at all, was on the run with my bloody wrench as a grim souvenir of the normal life I'd just left behind. I deleted the text, tore up the FBI agent's card, and sank onto my couch, my head in my hands. As the first light of dawn began to creep through my windows, I wondered how a simple borrowed tool had managed to destroy everything I thought I knew about my quiet, suburban life. And in the back of my mind, a terrifying question lingered. When would Dave be back to ensure my silence? The first time I heard the thumping from next door, I dismissed it as harmless home improvement. 3 months later, I realized I'd been listening to someone's desperate attempts to escape. It began on a quiet Sunday afternoon in late spring. I was lounging in my backyard, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the gentle rustle of leaves, when I heard it, a dull, rhythmic thumping coming from my neighbor's house. It wasn't loud enough to be annoying, just noticeable enough to pique my curiosity. I'd only moved into the neighborhood a few weeks prior, and I hadn't had much interaction with the couple next door beyond a few polite waves. They seemed nice enough mid-30s, always well-dressed, when I saw them leaving for work. The husband, Mark, had mentioned something about being in finance, while his wife, Sarah, worked from home. As the thumping continued, I assumed they must be renovating. It was the season for it, after all. I made a mental note to ask them about it next time I saw them, maybe offer to lend a hand if they needed it. That's what good neighbors do, right? But days passed, and the thumping persisted. Sometimes it would stop for a few hours, only to start up again in the middle of the night. It was always the same rhythm. 3 quick thumps followed by a pause, then repeat. At first, it was just a minor annoyance, easily ignored. But as weeks turned into a month, it began to grate on my nerves. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I ran into Mark in the driveway. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "Sounds like you've got quite the project going on, renovating the basement." Mark's head snapped up, his eyes widening for a split second before he composed himself. "Oh, that? Yeah, just some improvements. Sorry if it's been bothering you. We'll try to keep it down." There was something off about his tone, a nervousness that didn't fit with the casual nature of our conversation. Before I could press further, he mumbled something about being late for a meeting and hurried off to his car. That night, the thumping seemed louder than ever. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why would they be doing construction work in the middle of the night? And why did Mark seem so jumpy when I asked about it? The next day, I decided to talk to Sarah. I caught her as she was collecting the mail, looking just as exhausted as her husband had. "Hi, Sarah," I said, putting on my friendliest smile. "I was wondering if everything's okay. That construction noise has been going on for a while now." Sarah's face paled. "Construction noise?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, the thumping from your basement. Mark mentioned you were doing some improvements." For a moment, Sarah looked like she was about to say something. Her eyes darted towards her house, then back to me. But then, as if catching herself, she forced a smile. "Oh, right. Yes, it's taking longer than we expected. We'll try to wrap it up soon. Sorry for the disturbance." She practically ran back into her house, leaving me standing there, more confused than ever. Something was definitely not right. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to my neighbors' comings and goings. I noticed that Sarah rarely left the house anymore, and when she did, Mark was always with her. Their curtains remained drawn at all hours, and sometimes I could hear muffled arguments through the walls. And always, there was that persistent thumping. I began to have trouble sleeping, my mind conjuring up increasingly disturbing scenarios. Were they hiding something? Someone? The rational part of my brain told me I was being paranoid, that there had to be a logical explanation. But the thumping continued day and night, like a heartbeat of some terrible secret. About 2 months after the noises began, I was in my backyard, trying to distract myself with some gardening, when I heard a new sound mixed in with the familiar thumps. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, a cry for help. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, straining my ears. There was again a muffled voice, desperate and pleading, coming from my neighbor's basement window. Without thinking, I rushed to the fence separating our yards. The basement window was small and dirty, but as I peered through it, I caught a glimpse of movement inside. Someone was down there, and they were trying to get out. My heart pounding, I ran to my house and called the police. I tried to explain what I'd heard, what I'd seen, but even to my own ears, it sounded far-fetched. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone to check it out, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. As I waited for the police to arrive, the thumping stopped for the first time in months. The silence was somehow even more unnerving. When the officers finally showed up, Mark answered the door, looking calm and collected. I watched from my window as he spoke with them, gesturing casually and even laughing at one point. After a few minutes, the officers left without even entering the house. I was stunned. How could they not investigate further? Didn't they hear the noises, the cries for help? As the police car pulled away, Mark turned and looked directly at me through my window. The smile he gave me sent chills down my spine. That night, the thumping resumed, louder than ever. But now, knowing what I knew, or thought I knew, each thump felt like a punch to my gut. Someone was down there trapped, and I was the only one who seemed to care. I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. After tossing and turning for hours, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to investigate myself. The next day, I waited until I saw both Mark and Sarah leave the house. As soon as their car was out of sight, I crept over to their yard. The basement window was my target, small, but maybe just big enough for me to squeeze through. With shaking hands, I pried at the window. To my surprise, it gave way easily, as if it had been opened frequently from the inside. Taking a deep breath, I lowered myself into the darkness below. The basement was pitch black and reeked of mold, and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight. What I saw made my blood run cold. The basement was empty of any construction materials or tools. Instead, the walls were covered in scratches and what looked horribly like bloodstains. In the center of the room was a heavy chain bolted to the floor, ending in a rusty manacle. But it was empty. My mind reeled, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had been kept down here, imprisoned. But where were they now? A creak from upstairs made me jump. Footsteps. Someone was in the house. Panic gripped me as I realized my mistake. In my haste to investigate, I hadn't considered what I'd do if Mark or Sarah came home early. I quickly switched off my phone light and pressed myself against the wall, praying they wouldn't come down to the basement. The footsteps grew closer, descending the stairs. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The basement door opened, flooding the room with light, and there, silhouetted in the doorway, was Mark. "I was wondering how long it would take you to come snooping," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "Curiosity killed the cat, you know." I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to beg, but no words came out. Mark descended the stairs slowly, deliberately. "You should have minded your own business. Now you're part of this too." As he reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw something glint in his hand. A knife. In that moment, I understood with horrifying clarity. The thumping hadn't been from renovations or a trapped victim. It had been a lure, a trap set for a nosy neighbor, and I had walked right into it. Mark's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Welcome to the family business, neighbor. I hope you're not claustrophobic." As he advanced towards me, the basement door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. And I realized with a sickening certainty that soon I would be the one thumping, desperately hoping that anyone, would hear and understand. But I knew better than anyone. In this quiet suburban neighborhood, people preferred not to get involved. They dismissed the noise as home improvements, just like I had. And as Mark's hand closed around my throat, I heard the first thump. But this time, it was my own fist against the wall, a futile cry for help that I knew would go unanswered. The package sitting on my doorstep was addressed to my neighbor, but the photos inside would haunt me for years to come. I never should have opened it. It was a crisp autumn morning when I stumbled upon the brown paper-wrapped parcel. I had just returned from my usual morning jog, endorphins still buzzing through my system, when I noticed it tucked against my front door. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Just another delivery, probably misplaced by a hurried courier. I picked it up, intending to drop it off next door, when the name on the label caught my eye. Gregory Simmons. That wasn't my neighbor's name. The couple next door were the Andersons, Mike and Sarah. They'd lived there for years, long before I'd moved in 6 months ago. Curiosity piqued. I examined the package more closely. The address was correct, but the name was definitely wrong. I weighed it in my hands, feeling the soft give of its contents. Not a book or anything solid. Maybe clothes? I should have just left it on their doorstep. Should have rung the bell and handed it over without a second thought. But something about that name, Gregory Simmons, nagged at me. It was familiar somehow, tickling the edges of my memory. Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself back in my kitchen, the package on the counter before me. I told myself I was just looking for more information, maybe an invoice I could use to ensure it reached its rightful owner. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line. With slightly trembling hands, I carefully peeled back the brown paper. Inside was a nondescript white box. No labels, no markings. I hesitated for a moment, giving myself one last chance to back out. But curiosity won out. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a stack of photographs, glossy and new. The top one showed a young woman with auburn hair, smiling at the camera. She looked happy, carefree. I flipped to the next photo. The same woman, but this time her expression was fearful, her eyes wide with terror. My heart began to race as I flipped through more photos. Each one showed the woman in increasing states of distress. Bound, gagged, bloodied. I felt bile rising in my throat, but couldn't stop looking. The final photo made me drop the stack in horror. The woman lay motionless, her eyes vacant, unmistakably dead. Underneath the photos was a typed note. Job complete. Payment expected as agreed. Next target info enclosed. With shaking hands, I unfolded the paper beneath the note. It contained a name, address, and photo of another young woman. A sick feeling washed over me as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just evidence of a murder. It was a hit list. I staggered back from the counter, my mind reeling. What had I stumbled into? Who were the Andersons really? And who the hell was Gregory Simmons? As if in answer to my unspoken question, I heard a knock at my door. Panic gripped me. Had they seen me take the package? Did they know I'd opened it? "Hey, neighbor," Mike Anderson's cheery voice called out. "Sorry to bother you, but I think we got one of your packages by mistake. Thought I'd check if you had one of ours." I froze, my eyes darting between the scattered contents of the package and the door. I had to get rid of the evidence. Had to pretend everything was normal. But my body wouldn't move. "Hello," Mike called again, a hint of impatience in his tone. "You in there, Jack?" Swallowing hard, I forced myself to respond. "Jay, just a second." I stammered, frantically shoving the photos and papers back into the box. I wrapped it haphazardly in the brown paper, praying it looked undisturbed. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door, hoping my face didn't betray the terror I felt. Mike stood there, his usual friendly smile in place, holding a small Amazon package. "Hey there," he said. "This came for you yesterday. Sarah noticed it this morning and asked me to bring it over." I took the package with numb fingers, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks, Mike. And yeah, actually, I do have something that came for you." I retrieved the brown parcel, holding it out like it might bite me. Mike's eyes locked onto the package, his smile faltering for just a moment. Was that recognition in his eyes? Fear? But in a blink, his cheerful demeanor was back. "Great, thanks. Must be Sarah's online shopping again," he laughed, but the sound seemed forced. As he took the package, his fingers brushed mine, and I had to suppress a shudder. Had these hands killed that woman in the photos? We exchanged a few more pleasantries, my responses on autopilot as my mind raced. As soon as Mike turned to leave, I shut the door, leaning against it as my legs threatened to give way. What was I supposed to do now? Go to the police? But with what evidence? I'd tamper with the package, open someone else's mail. And even if they believed me, what then? If the Andersons really were involved in contract killings, my life wouldn't be worth much once they found out I'd talked. For the next few days, I lived in a state of constant anxiety. Every car door slamming made me jump. Every shadow outside my window could be someone coming for me. I found myself watching the Andersons obsessively, looking for any sign that they knew what I'd seen. But life seemed to go on as normal next door. Mike left for work each morning, briefcase in hand. Sarah tended to her garden. They hosted a barbecue that weekend. The sound of laughter drifting over the fence as I sat in my darkened house, jumping at every noise. I knew I should do something, say something. That poor woman in the photos haunted my dreams. And what about the next target? Could I live with myself if another innocent person died because I was too afraid to speak up? A week after I'd opened the package, I finally worked up the courage to go to the police. I'd rehearsed my story a dozen times, trying to find a way to explain what I'd seen without incriminating myself. As I grabbed my keys, steeling myself for what was to come, my phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number. Curiosity killed the cat neighbor. Don't make us add another name to the list. My blood ran cold. They knew. Somehow, they knew what I'd seen. My hand shook as another text came through. Be smart. Forget what you saw, or the next package might have your photo in it. I sank to the floor, keys falling from my lifeless fingers. What had I gotten myself into? And more importantly, how was I going to get out of it alive? The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I installed a security system, changed my locks, even considered moving. But a part of me knew it was futile. If the Andersons or whoever they worked for wanted to get to me, they would. I found myself jumping at every sound, suspecting every stranger. The cheerful barista at my local coffee shop. Was she watching me? The jogger who passed my house every morning. Was he taking notes on my routine? My whole world had shrunk to a series of threats and potential dangers. Ironically, the only time I felt somewhat safe was when I saw Mike or Sarah. Their continued normalcy, the mundane rhythm of their daily lives, provided a strange comfort. As long as they were acting like nothing had changed, maybe I was safe. Maybe they were willing to let things lie if I kept my mouth shut. But the guilt ate at me. Every time I saw a missing person poster, every news report about an unsolved murder, I wondered, was this their work? Could I have prevented it if I'd been braver? If I'd gone to the police despite the threat? Months passed, and slowly, life began to resume a semblance of normalcy. I found myself relaxing just a little. Maybe it was over. Maybe they decided I wasn't a threat. Then came the knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat as I approached, half expecting to see Mike's cheerful face hiding murderous intent. But when I opened the door, it wasn't my neighbor standing there. It was a young woman, her red-rimmed eyes filled with desperation. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm looking for my sister." This was the last address she texted me from before she disappeared. "Have you seen her?" She held out a photo, and I felt the world drop away beneath my feet. I recognized the face immediately. It was the woman from the target list, the next victim. In that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. I had a choice to make. Stay silent and save myself, or speak up and potentially save others. But at what cost? As I looked into the hopeful eyes of this woman searching for her sister, I realized there was only one choice I could live with. Whatever the consequences, I had to tell the truth. "Come in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "There's something you need to know. And then, we need to go to the police." As I closed the door behind her, I caught a glimpse of movement from the Andersons' house. Sarah stood at her window, watching us. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something there that chilled me to my core, a cold, calculating look that didn't belong on the face of a friendly neighborhood housewife. I knew then that by choosing to speak up, I was signing my own death warrant. But as I turned back to the worried sister in my living room, I also knew I was doing the right thing. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be ruled by fear any longer. The game was up, and it was time to face the consequences of that fateful decision to open a package that was never meant for me.